The Spectral Tow Truck by Richard Elsliger. Copyright 2024. No one ever wants to drive Sycamore Road at night. Not ever. The legend of Sycamore Road is well known to locals, and they know better than to navigate the treacherous two-lane blacktop after sunset. The risk, it is said, does not lie in the dangerous character of the road with its twists and switchbacks, but rather in the act of breaking down on the road. That is when the trouble starts. That's when things start to get crazy. Duncan McCormick was new to the sleepy village of Hampton, a small community established in the very early part of the 20th century, yet still thriving on a local economy of roadside fruit and vegetable stands, along with 2 antique stores, a gas station, a general store, and a post office. The agitations of city life had taken their toll on Duncan, and he wanted out. He selected the village of Hampton after careful consideration and extensive research. On a cool autumn afternoon, Duncan moved into his 100-year-old wood-framed house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The house needed work, but Duncan was handy with paintbrushes and saws. He dumped off his personal effects in the midst of a sparse but sizable living room amid a few sticks of modest furniture he'd taken from his apartment. He went to sorting and separating, moving utensils, arranging pots and pans, and stacking plates in the kitchen. He brought his clothes to the master bedroom and left them there in a trash bag until he could purchase a chest of drawers. Perhaps he'd pick up one at the antique store he passed on the way through town. After inflating the inflatable bed, Duncan returned to the living room and fell in a heap on the sofa. He took a deep sigh and recounted the life he'd left behind in the big city. Life, he thought, was constant transition, a constant evolution or devolution, depending on the circumstances that crossed one's path. We all traveled that one-way road, encountering a variety of challenges along the way. We all knew where that road led, and the slower the ride, the better. Moving to a small community would slow that pace, and with a little help might extend his life if but for a brief moment more. Such deep thoughts for such a joyous occasion, Duncan excised the negativity from his mind and relaxed in his new surroundings. Rays of sunlight crept through the western exposure of his living room window, and he removed his phone. There had to be a decent place to eat. The village of Hampton had no restaurants, so he checked the next town over. He didn't want to eat at a chain restaurant, but rather wanted exposure to the indigenous wildlife, as he liked to call the locals. Duncan located an obscure restaurant in the town of Porter, it being a good 30-mile jaunt from his house. He did a quick mental calculation in his mind and concluded that his EV had enough battery to get him there and back with a little charge left to spare, but no more. Duncan locked the door to his house and hopped in the EV. He rolled out of the smooth asphalt driveway, only the gentle hum of his electric vehicle keeping constant company. Several twists and turns brought him out of the neighborhood and onto a long stretch of road, Sycamore Road. Duncan flipped down the sun visor and motored on. He periodically checked the solitary navigation screen, prominently displayed in the center of his EV, just below the dashboard. The screen reflected that he was en route to the Meet and Eat Inn, a rather uninspired carnivorous play on words for a presumptively fine cuisine. The name appealed to Duncan, indicative of a comfortable hometown aura, reminiscent of the place where he spent his formative years. The onboard computer interrupted the drive and verbally announced that he needed a charge. Duncan ignored the warning and pushed on. He'd pick up a charge somewhere in town while he enjoyed some good food and soaked up the local ambience. The sun sank beneath the horizon, and Sycamore Road took on a shadowy and ominous appearance. Large trees loomed on either side of the 2-lane road, their branches interlacing to form an overhanging canopy of gloom. Duncan's GPS became spotty and faded in and out, losing, then regaining, then losing the signal again. He saw no other cars on the road and wondered why. Sycamore proved to be a true driver's road, with its sharp curves and long straights. He drove on, relishing the road's unique character. 20 miles of twisty bits, and straightaways later, he came out of the woods and saw the faint lights of residences in the distance. The battery symbol on his EV screen now displayed an X crossed over it and began to flash in the red, reminding Duncan of the low charge. "It's okay, baby, we'll make it. I trust you." He patted the dashboard with affection and steered on toward the outskirts of town. Porter materialized on his screen, and he was nearly upon the downtown core, In many ways, the town of Porter manifested itself as a mirror reflection of Hampton, with the same antique shops, general store, and post office. The roadside concession stands, if there were any, had closed and vacated the area for the evening. Duncan made a turn off of Sycamore Road and rolled into the city center. The computer screen announced his arrival, and he saw the Meet and Eat Inn across the street. He checked his digital map for a charging station but found none, then parked the EV at an old-style parking meter, inserting enough change to give him 2 hours. The town looked like a slice out of the 1950s. The paint on adjacent buildings was faded, and the lettering of a local auto repair shop reflected the fonts of a 1950s Magneto style that Duncan recognized from old movies out of that era. Duncan exited and set the security features on his vehicle, then crossed the street. When he reached the sidewalk, 2 cars raced past him in a hurry to get somewhere. "Where's the fire?" said Duncan. He turned to see them make a fast right-hander onto Sycamore Road, and then they were gone. He pulled on the heavy wooden door and entered the establishment, expecting the restaurant to buzz with activity, given its 5-star ratings and highly positive reviews. Only a handful of people occupied a scattering of seats at assorted tables, and the bar was empty of patrons. Duncan checked the time, then took a seat at the bar to break up the monotony of the place. It was actually a strategic move on his part to get an opportunity to talk to the bartender and get a feel for the local wildlife. "You're new here," said the bartender. She looked to be around 25 years of age, with long honey-blonde hair. Her eyes sparkled a magnificent porcelain blue, even in the dull light of the restaurant, and they captured Duncan's attention. "Yes, and new to the area as well," said Duncan. "Where are you from?" "I just moved to Hampton," said Duncan. She nodded with familiarity, but also displayed a sign of trepidation that took hold of her features. "How did you get to town?" she asked. "You mean here?" asked Duncan. "Yes, here," she said. It was a straight run on Sycamore Road for about 25 miles. A concerned look took hold of the young woman. "Well, I wouldn't recommend you go back that way tonight. Find a different way home." She handed him a menu. Duncan took the menu and placed it on the counter, wanting a good reason why he should not travel back in the direction from whence he came. He looked at her with a puzzled, almost incredulous stare. "What's wrong with the way I got here?" he asked. "I'll tell you, but would you like to order first?" "Pay to play, I get it," said Duncan with a sideways smile. "Can I start with a salad?" "You're joking, right? Or hadn't you noticed the name on the door?" She smiled coyly and rolled her eyes. "Point well taken," said Duncan. He perused the menu and observed a variety of meats served with potatoes. "Well, that sure is a no-nonsense menu," he said. "I'll go with the standard fare. How about a steak and fried potatoes?" She took down the order on an old-style notepad. "And how do you want the steak?" "Well done," said Duncan. "And a drink?" "I'll have a glass of water." "How about a beer?" she said. "Non-drinker here, sweetie, but thank you for the suggestion." "You're welcome," she said, giving him a smile. She retreated to the back and gave the order to the cook. He put the food on the burners, and she returned with a glass of water and slid it over the table. "So you were about to tell me why I need to find a different way home," said Duncan, taking a sip from the glass. "Yes, a different way." "Well, if I told you, then you might think I'm crazy." "Well, it's okay to be a bit crazy in this life. I've only known you for, 10 minutes? I only can say that we're both performing roles at the moment. You happen to be my server tonight, and I happen to be the willing customer. Our roles might change, though, as the evening progresses." "Oh, might they?" she asked. "You haven't even asked for my name." "Well, Catherine, I wasn't sure if I should call you Catherine or Kathy. May I call you Kathy?" Catherine blushed at the temporary lapse of situational awareness. She looked at her name tag and tapped it with a forefinger. "Very observant of you," she said. "So you were about to tell me why I should take a different route home. Do tell." The steak sizzled on the grill in the back and diverted Catherine from her focus on Duncan. She returned her gaze to him once more and leaned against the counter. "Well, are you sitting down?" "Yes, you're sitting down." "Okay, I'm going to tell you an awful truth. You never want to break down on Sycamore Road at night. If you break down, you disappear. Why you disappear is the big question, but I have a theory." "I like theories. It's so scientific," said Duncan, rubbing his hands together. "This is serious stuff, not a joke," she admonished. "Please continue," said Duncan. He quickly adjusted the countenance of his face to conform. "Many of us believe there's a tow truck that comes to get the unfortunate soul and tows both the driver and their disabled car to another dimension." "Another dimension?" said Duncan. Huh. How do you know that if no one apparently lives to tell the tale? That's a good question, Mr. McCormick, but call me Duncan. Okay, Duncan. That's why we call it a theory. It's one possible explanation of many, right? How often does it happen? It doesn't happen very often anymore because we all know better than to drive that road. Catherine tapped nervously on the counter and took a look back to the kitchen as if her focus alone might speed up the cooking process. Maybe it's just a plain old serial killer, said Duncan. We do have more than a few of them doing their thing in the good old US of A. It's actually a little more than a theory. I mean, it was a theory before cell phones, but there was one case where someone was able to make a call in their cell. They called 911 just before they disappeared. Interesting. So what were their parting words? Asked Duncan with a sarcastic smile. I can see you're not taking this seriously at all, said Catherine. Okay, I'll be more serious, said Duncan, making a vague attempt at changing his face to be more attentive and less dismissive. To answer your question, the caller said that they saw a black tow truck arriving, an awful thing that faded in and out of reality, that was both there and not there. No one really knows what any of that means other than there's a tow truck that you better worry about if it comes your way. Duncan looked skeptical. So how does this apply to me? I drive an EV. I don't care what you drive, said Catherine. Just be careful out there and take a different way home. I'd actually like to see you again, she said. I'd like to see you too, said Duncan, surprised at her revelation so soon. Let me check on the food, she said, and retreated to the kitchen. She popped out from the swinging doors with her hands filled. She brought the plate to his table and set down a delicious steak and fried potatoes before him. Duncan visually absorbed the home-cooked wonder and inhaled the spicy aromas coming from the plate. Smells divine, he said. Catherine set the utensils before him. Enjoy, she said, and left him to eat in private. Duncan savored the meal. He relished the steak and the potatoes he deemed were seasoned to perfection. Catherine periodically watched Duncan from the corner of the restaurant as she waited on other patrons and cleared tables. She found something about Duncan to be irresistible in the most audacious way, a way that made her unsure of herself. There was something mysterious and magnetic about him, a thing she'd not felt in a long time. She approached the bar and stopped front and center before Duncan. Would you like a dessert? She asked. Sure, what would you suggest? How about some homemade apple pie? She said. Duncan soaked up Catherine's radiant smile, and he too felt an attraction to this woman. He fought back the memories of relationships past and wanted to move forward in his life, to get a fresh start, and this woman might be the fresh start he needed to complement his move from the big city. Tonight was a night to celebrate, but he held his enthusiasm in check, not to appear desperate. Apple pie sounds heavenly, said Duncan. Catherine flashed her pristine teeth and retreated to the kitchen. She rounded up a slice of heaven for Duncan and immediately returned with the dessert. She placed the slice on the bar and methodically set out a fork and knife at either side of the plate. Wow, home cooking just like Mom used to make, said Duncan, running his fork through the delicate flaky layers. The syrupy sweetness of apple and pie crust performed cartwheels on his palate. Do you like it? She asked. What's not to like about the best apple pie I ever ate? That and good company. You are generous with the compliments, she said. Can I get your number? He asked. Catherine paused to consider. She knew what it meant. That infinitesimally small act of sharing her contact information was a large step toward changing her life forever. She looked into Duncan's eyes and saw no hint of deception, but rather a wild desire to get to know her. She asked him to hand over his phone. Duncan withdrew his phone from the leather folds of his jacket and unlocked it. She gently took the phone from his warm hands, punched in her number, and handed it back. Don't keep me waiting, she said. You can be sure I won't, he said. Can I get you anything else? She asked. I think that'll do it, he said. I'll tally it up, she said, and wrote out a bill. She handed it to Duncan. Well, that was a deal, he said, and gave her a $100 bill. Keep the change. I can't do that, she said. Your meal was only $30. You want to give me a $70 tip? Sure, said Duncan. It was worth it. I'll call you. Duncan got up from the bar stool and headed for the door. Remember, said Catherine, do not use Sycamore Road. Duncan smiled. I'll see you soon. He turned and exited, triggering the antiquated overhead bell. The cool evening air touched him with a haunting kiss. He spotted his EV at the parking meter. In the last remnants of twilight, the old-style meter looked more like a snake swaying in the wind. Duncan cleared his mind of the image, and he headed to his ride. The streets were devoid of traffic, and cars that were parked on either side of his EV had left. The sweet sounds of crickets serenaded the night, and Duncan stopped to listen. He smiled and took a deep breath of fresh, unadulterated air, unpolluted by the grime of the big city he left behind. He settled into his EV and programmed the way home. The computer defaulted to Sycamore Road, and Duncan paused. Should he heed the warning? It all sounded like such contrived nonsense. To hell with it, he said, and put his EV in drive, headed towards Sycamore Road. He checked the charge and calculated that 15% would be enough to see him home, with a few percentage points to spare. He turned on Sycamore at the outskirts of town and rolled along the two-lane road, dark shadows flanking either side of the glassy, smooth asphalt. He navigated deeper into the thick of an old, mystical land, the fine ribbon of Sycamore Road encased by omnipotent trees that threatened to suffocate all who dared travel there by night. He stepped up the speed to get out of the clutches of the forested area, desperate to get through and leave it all behind, legend or no legend. Duncan watched the charge of his battery drop in precipitous increments on the computer screen. He lay off the throttle, but the battery continued to drop at an incredible rate. A rumble of apprehension passed through Duncan, the words of Catherine's admonishment coming back to his mind. But it all had to be a ruse, an unsubstantiated legend. The waning battery of his EV finally let go and zeroed out. He coasted in silence to the shoulder of the road and came to a stop. "Well, this isn't good," he said. Duncan undid his seatbelt, exited, and slammed the door. The car shuddered as if to protest this unwarranted abuse. He looked up and down the blacktop, listening for a potential ride. The road was empty, vacant of commuters, sightseers, or joyriders. Duncan paused to listen. He heard the steady chirp of crickets, a surround sound orchestra, their tiny melodies powerful and seemingly sympathetic to his plight. Then, at once, all of the chirping stopped. Duncan turned and squinted. The faintest dot of light metamorphosed out of the tar-stained blackness in what looked to be a good 3 miles down the road. First it wasn't, then it was. The small beacon seemed to come from nothingness. Duncan listened and focused. The clatter of an old engine wound through the gears and pierced the night. It was getting closer. Duncan watched in rigid anticipation, but the closer it got, the faster his anticipation turned to apprehension. A pair of headlights came into focus, and he could see that it was a dark truck behind the beams, a massive tow truck. Duncan's fear went off the chart, and he fumbled in his jacket pocket for his phone. He hit the dial button for Catherine. "Hello," she said. "Catherine, it's Duncan. I'm in a bit of trouble here." A bolt of fear shot through her. A multitude of scenarios raced through her head, and she dreaded knowing what she knew all along. It could be but one scenario, and one scenario alone. "What kind of trouble?" "I ran out of battery," he said. "Where are you now?" "Sycamore Road," he said. No, you can't be serious," she said. "I see it now, the truck, the tow truck. No, please, no," she said, her voice tightening. It's here, oh my God, it's here," he exclaimed. "Get out of there, Duncan, run!" Duncan began to sprint, but the thing emerged from the driver's door and with unholy speed was upon him. A deathly, faceless figure hovered over him and applied an unseen force that pushed Duncan toward his EV, making tacit demand that he get behind the wheel and never exit again. "What are you doing?" said Duncan, his voice quivering in a higher octave. "Duncan, what's happening?" Catherine demanded. "It's opening up," he exclaimed. "It's opening up." "What's opening up?" she asked. "Swirling black," he said. Catherine could hear rushing wind in the phone, an otherworldly torrent of sound. The swirling, gaping void of another dimension was upon Duncan, whipping his face with supernatural fury. "Duncan, please get out of there," she pleaded. "Too late," he said. Catherine heard a groan that split the natural world asunder. Duncan whispered one feeble word, "No," and then the winds died down and all went silent. Catherine looked at the screen of her phone and it flashed the words, "Dropped call." She put down her phone and removed a notepad from her apron. She sat on a bar stool and wrote down every detail of what she heard. Catherine looked around the restaurant. Everyone had gone and it was time to close up. The cook came out and sat beside her at a stool and asked what had happened. He was a local and knew all about the tow truck of Sycamore Road. "Why didn't he listen to you?" asked the cook. "Curiosity," she said with a vague but forlorn smile. "Curiosity kills around here," he said. "Yes, it does," said Catherine. "It certainly does." Let's close up." Catherine tore off the notes from her pad and stuffed the information in her denim pocket before locking up. "Goodbye, Duncan, wherever you are now," she said with a turn of the key, locking the big oak door. When Catherine arrived home, she removed the notations from her pocket and put them on the roll-top desk, where many more notes were scattered about. She opened her computer and began detailing the specifics of what she had heard this evening, the last living moments of a man she might have grown to love. She added a chapter calling it "The Strange Case of Duncan McCormick" to her book entitled "The Haunting of Sycamore Road."